Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you were able to grab lunch, grab a snack. We're going to dive right into our next session. So I'd like to welcome Shafi Koker, coming to us all the way from the United Kingdom. Shafi is the Global Director of Media, Technology, and Consumer Engagement at GlaxoSmithKline, and he has been with GSK for the past 3.5 years. Shafi is joined by our very own Lucas Long. Lucas is a tag governance specialist and product manager of Tag Inspector, and they are going to discuss how consumer privacy requirements are shaking up CPG digital marketing. With that, take it away, Shafi and Lucas.
Thank you very much, Chase, and thank you, Shafi, for joining me today for this discussion. I think whenever we're talking about these various different privacy requirements and what these changes are, some of the impacts, how we could mitigate them, it's best to start just thinking about the changes that are coming. So on this first slide, we'll kind of introduce the primary changes. The first one being consumer expectations. Without consumer expectations changing, no regulatory changes happen, no technical restrictions are really put in place. So we'll talk a little bit about those and then how that's shaking out. Number two are the regulatory changes that really flow from those consumer expectations. Lawmakers take notice. We're starting to see more laws such as GDPR in the EU and then patchwork privacy in the US with California, now Virginia, and Colorado all passing their own pieces of legislation. Even China getting into the mix with their new privacy laws set to go into effect at the end of this week, actually. And then third, as far as these changes go, we're all dealing with a lot of technical restrictions. So the deprecation of third-party cookies across all browsers by the end of 2023, according to Google's most recent updated timeline, as well as what we're already seeing within Safari, within Mozilla, and within Firefox for some of those restrictions on first-party cookies, as well as the effective deprecation of third-party cookies already. So the first change here, when we're talking about consumer expectations and just how large of an impact this really is, you'll see on this next slide just a few statistics that I think illustrate some of these points. The key one here is around 81% of people saying that the potential risks because of data collection outweigh the benefits. People are becoming more aware of what's collected, how it's used, and quite frankly, without the transparency necessary, they're afraid of what that impact is on them and feeling like negative impacts are going to come. We've seen this really, especially in the EU, across a number of different websites, and especially in the CPG space, with a large proportion of users that are not accepting consent, leading to large gaps in observable data collection on the various different websites. So, Shafi, I'll start with just a question for you related to this phenomenon. How have you managed this observed change in the data with internal stakeholders that may not necessarily understand some of the nuance of why these things are happening and what it means for their various different activities?
Yeah. Lucas, first off, thanks for having me here, right? Really appreciate it. I'm going to go back a few years, right, when GDPR actually hit, right? There was a lot of chaos, right? And we had a massive drop in GA data, and making those necessary changes to adapt, and also at the same time changing vendors because we were seeing that it wasn't really working for us with the vendor that we originally chose. But managing that expectation internally was quite difficult, to be honest, right? Because suddenly you're going from seeing 100% monitoring to I'm only seeing about 13 people go on my website now, and there's a lot of people complaining, right? Brand managers are coming to me and saying, "Hey, what's going on? I can't track anything. How am I supposed to retarget things?" So it was a bit of an issue, but managing their expectations, stating why it's dropped and the reason behind it, and at the same time, right, you have to keep on and continue on looking at the consumer at the heart, and that's key because that allows you to look at it from a consumer's lens. And going back to what Joanna said earlier, that how would you feel comfortable giving the data away about yourself to that company? And it's about improving that experience for the user, focusing on doing A/B testing and optimizing the consent experience itself. That's key here. And going above and beyond and focusing on exceeding their expectations, that's the success, right? And the way that we did it, I'll give you an example, right? Is we looked at mobile testing, for example, and simple A/B testing of moving the accept button to the right-hand side, because most people are right-handed. So naturally, a person's thumb would naturally go to the right-hand side, and that'll be the fastest way to click on accept, right? Did that actually work? Is the hypothesis true that more people are likely to accept if we did that? Changing the background color of the actual button as well. Just doing those small tests helps to improve the acceptance rate, because you're making it easier for the user at the end to accept or decline.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember a lot of those tests taking place, and that kind of leads us directly into that next point and these changes that are happening around the regulatory updates. We could see here in this next slide just a brief timeline, and what's really important is we saw a lot of these regulatory changes beginning 2018 when GDPR went into effect. And then more recently, we're seeing a lot more different regulations go into place, updates to regulations. California, CCPA went into effect, and then already this past November, CPRA was passed to really enhance and clarify a lot of the requirements there. Now, with this increased pace of regulatory requirements and changes that are happening, especially for a global organization, working within all of these various different markets, and a lot of different nuance and requirements as to what opt-out means, what consent means, what language needs to look like on a consent banner, what does transparency mean, what all needs to be provided at the top level, at the second level to a user. With the varying nature of these global regulations, what are some of the core things that you're really looking for and asking of the different marketing and advertising technology platforms that you're using within the organization, just to ensure compliance and to ensure that the users' wishes are being respected as expected?
Yeah, so the key thing is governance, right? And we'll talk more about this in a bit. But it's about looking at any additional calls being made, i.e., piggybacking, that's associated with any of the platforms that we use. That's kind of critical, because we need to make sure that there's zero piggybacking happening off our pixels, because we need to know what's on our sites. Secondly, it's digging into the data that's being collected by each platform. Why are they needing this data? And having that governance around this. And what are they going to use it for as well? How are they going to use it, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's to ensure control throughout the entire architecture, right? So managing all the different digital platforms via one tag management solution, and having standards around that and deploying that across all your websites, right? At GSK, it's very complex because we have, I think when we did do this in partnership with InfoTrust, we had something like 1,300 websites. Thank God that's gone down to like 800 something now. But it's still a massive challenge, right? Irrespective of how many websites you have.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Understanding what's there, looking at any kinds of piggybacking and then putting controls around that to be able to not be surprised down the line. And also have a foundation of documentation to be able to inform any of those new regulatory changes or updates. Now, beyond just the regulatory updates, we're also obviously facing a lot of technical restrictions that are being imposed in order to really enforce those expectations of users and how those are changing and force user privacy, which net is a very, very good thing for the web at large. So when we're thinking about these technical restrictions, and you can see kind of supplemented on this timeline here, some of those different changes have gone into place. But the key implications here being that effectively third-party cookies, which are those, the IDs contained within them, are used to join those data sets. So impacts on targeting, on measurement, and then duration restrictions on first-party cookies. Now, I know that specifically the third-party cookie deprecation piece here is very difficult for CPG organizations, just given the traditional lack of kind of personal relationships with users, not being as much of an opportunity for that one-to-one relationship and the ability to gain first-party identity with things like registration, signups, et cetera, when you're really just focused on brand websites. So I'm curious, how are you kind of approaching some of the challenges with privacy safe targeting, considering some of those limitations to the just broad recommendations for your industry specifically?
So you've hit the nail on the head. There is the most difficult problem being faced by CPG companies right now, right? Because like GSK, there's only a limited amount of first-party data that we have, so we can collect it to a certain degree, and we are looking at how can we improve that and increase that rate. But until then, there's other alternatives that we need to look at as well, and that's looking at the likes of working with LiveRamp, for example. But having those low match rates, that's the questionable accuracy without third-party cookies at the moment. And once third-party cookies disappear, we need to do something about that, right? So it's just about testing various different approaches. And having talked to different CPG organizations myself, I was scared that it was only my organization that's going through this. But after speaking to various different CPG organizations and speaking to InfoTrust as well, we realized actually we're in the same boat as everyone else at the moment. So, which was a bit of sigh of relief, but at the same time, it's a bit scary, right? Because it's just around the corner. But just looking at those different identity solutions, looking at different targeting strategies, how do we activate across different publishing partners? So the likes of, in the US, we use Meredith in the US, right? So partnering with those kind of publishers globally, and then exploring how to best use second-party data. Right now, second-party data can be, the terminology can be interpreted in various different ways. The way that I interpret second-party data is that it's someone else's first party, right? So, for example, Google's automated solutions, and focusing on expanding that first-party identifiable data sets. Very, very important, right? How are you going to do that? And this is something that's challenging for GSK right now, as to how we collect that data, how we bring that in and raise the standards internally, right, as to how we can activate against that as well within the next few years. But again, sorry to be negative here, but yes, you're collecting the first party, and you might have already some first party data, but how accurate is that first party data, right? That's still going to be a challenge no matter how we move forward.
Yeah, no, makes sense, especially with different solutions starting to be rolled out, like Apple with their different type of email solutions within iOS, where it's kind of that cat and mouse game, if you will. In any kind of a solution that's put forth, there is some sort of a protection or workarounds, I guess, to be able to address it. But I think that's really good advice there. Focusing on growing that first-party data set of identifiable users, and then testing different ways in which to activate it, including working with, even if we think of Google in like a publisher type of a context, a publisher with the largest reach on the web, and leveraging their first-party data through things like customer match and similar audiences to really expand on what you're able to do yourselves. So no, that's interesting, and follows that theme, right, of testing various different approaches that we've looked at throughout today. Kind of moving on from some of these restrictions and the doom and gloom, I want to get your thoughts on some really core areas to focus on when we're thinking about navigating this new reality, and some of the really core takeaways for people to be thinking about following, and strategies, I guess, to be able to take away. So if we look at this next slide, the first key, and I know we've talked about this and we've done a lot of work together on helping to really gain visibility into the platforms, the data that's in use, and analyzing even advertising strategies. Joanna mentioned it before, but having that clear-eyed look at what strategies are reliant on technologies that are going away, what aspects of our measurement architecture are reliant on data that we might not have access to in the future due to some of those different regulatory requirements. With so many brands and so many markets, so many different countries that a global CPG organization is working with, it's difficult to have that visibility and understand what platforms are in use, how are strategies kind of differing from place to place, what behavior is allowed, where can I use cookies, where are consent requirements different. I guess, how have you approached that complexity and being able to get the necessary visibility in order to understand that current state to really develop, your roadmap that you're executing on moving into this future?
So it's been a long journey, right? We in the EU got a bit of a head start in comparison to other legislations like CCPA. But the first and foremost thing is doing an audit of what's on your sites, right? And trust me, it's scary because you think you know, but when you do use tools like Tag Inspector and then you actually scrape and look at what's on your site, it can be a bit scary for some sites. And it was questionable, and it was escalated to a certain degree within internally here as well. But then once you've got that kind of visibility, you know what to do in terms of classifying those tags in a certain way, as however your privacy and compliance and legal team want to do that. But it gives you that kind of way to understand, audit, remove, include, whatever you want to do, right, in that sense. But also determining what regulations are applicable for each platform is a use case by case basis, right? But you're ensuring that there's legal compliance with those specific tags. And then having a post-audit, governance framework, per se, to ensure that you only have what's business critical on your platforms that's being leveraged, and removing anything else that isn't, right? And also having additional processes for any new platform as well. So, having a form to fill out by whichever platform it is, so that specifically this is being checked by a specific governance team, and you're literally checking through and making sure that this is compliant, not only from media standpoint, but tech and all the different teams as well within the organization.
Okay. No, that's interesting. I mean, you talked about it, auditing, understanding what's there, gaining that visibility, but then starting to take those deep dives into each platform, understanding how is this technology used, what data is being processed, what markets is this technology used within, what laws are applicable, and being able to answer those questions just as a current state to be able to inform compliance documentations, compliance actions, as well as some of those strategies moving forward that we're thinking about testing in order to be able to future-proof aspects of the strategy as well as the architecture for third-party cookies or lack of data due to consent. One thing that you kind of alluded to there is the second thing that's wanted to discuss here for navigating the new reality, and that is the definition of global standards. So once you have everything on the table, we've seen a lot of organizations get a lot of value in, defining what is approved from a platform standpoint, standardizing data models so that you can use just a central data object structure to inform everything and enable integration kind of down the line. And I know you've leveraged a lot of those things to really successfully grow that analytics and data maturity at GSK. What would you say have been the keys to building that solid standardized foundation as your organization has moved forward with its digital maturity?
Governance. It's just having that kind of standards approach, including across all different teams, right? It's not a one team does this and that's it. It's legal, tech, marketing, compliance, privacy, media. Everybody has to join forces on this to make it a success, right? But it's about forming processes as well. So I mentioned, having forms to be filled out, etc. This isn't just a form that I filled out and I said, yeah, this is what we need. This is a joint effort between everybody to make sure that we have everything, and it ensures that every team is happy with what needs to be filled out for this as well, including our privacy and compliance, right? And vendors aren't happy about this, but at the same time, we're responsible for what's on our sites, right? If you're ever fined, hopefully we'll never get fined, but if you are ever fined because you're not making the consumers' lives easier, it's going to be your problem as a CPG. So that's where it's so important to be working closely with all these different teams internally, having that documentation for a platform to be approved and implemented. Look at specific use cases around data collected. So, I'm not going to name the vendor, but internally right now, we're looking at some vendors where how are they collecting the data? What are they going to do with it? How are they going to process it? Who's responsible for this, right? If something goes wrong, et cetera, et cetera. those things need to be discussed internally as well as with the partners themselves. And again, just ongoing monitoring of those tags and making sure that we're using Tag Inspector on a monthly basis across our entire portfolio to make sure that nothing has dropped or been added that we haven't been approved of, right? So having that kind of safe and block list is vital for the success of this. And lastly, it's consistency, right? So having that global data structure is very, very important. So what we've done is, just using Google Analytics, for example, we've rolled out something called Brilliant Basics. And what this is just, we called it Brilliant Basics, but it's just a standardization of all the data definitions and tracking requirements across all the digital properties so that everyone knows what they're looking for and how to compare, no matter what brand they're looking at. So it's that consistency. And that enables us to have integrations as well as with global comparisons, etc. And it just makes life a lot easier, right, to manage from a tech standpoint, but also if you're using Google Analytics itself as well, it just makes it really easy to digest that information. So it's having those basics, I would say, really helps with the process.
It makes a lot of sense. And that's, where those global standards, come in. Now, I want to follow up on one point there. You had mentioned about kind of like a governance team, right? And all the teams working in the same direction, which I think is extremely important, especially for marketers and advertising folks to remember, is that legal is not your enemy. Your competition is your enemy, right? So everyone is, focused on the same goals at the end of the day. And it's working within these new requirements and putting forth, doing, as Joanna had mentioned before, what would I be comfortable with? And making sure that you are following along those guidelines and you are following along the rules of the game as outlined by those different regulations. But for the team, as you're working with it, Shafi, do you have kind of a centralized global governance team that's with representatives from different parts of the business to define some of these standards and make sure everything is kind of up to snuff, or how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, we've got the team built. So what we've done is we've kind of Frankenstein model, brought everyone in, and just said, look, this is how we need to be working forward. And we've made this tagging governance team basically, which includes marketing, media, legal, compliance, you name it, basically you're there, right? Tech, just to align on making sure that we have the right things, right, on our websites.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. And it's something that I've seen be very, very effective as well across organizations, getting everyone, all the necessary stakeholders in one place and kind of regular connects in order to be able to, define these standards, understand what are we testing, what does success look like, what needs to change, and making sure all voices are heard when really defining those strategies moving forward. And that leads directly into the final point. And I know it's been brought up already and it will be brought up more. But really that third key to navigating the new reality is that culture of testing. We can't really underscore enough that a lot is going to be changing over the next 18 months. If we really think about the end of 2023 as that really day of reckoning as it pertains to privacy, and focusing on how technologies are changing. Google and the Chrome team is still working on the privacy sandbox. So who knows what Fledge will look like for retargeting, potentially, at least for users within the Chrome browser. Who knows what targeting to cohorts maybe look like. Well, I guess in addition to that, also what ways of different measurement and how to measure the effectiveness of different strategies as you're running these tests, and also to measure the effectiveness of strategies in the future post third-party cookies. But as you're moving into this new environment with all the uncertainty around what parameters you'll be working with, what the technology will be able to do, how are you really thinking about testing specifically, trying different vendors as well as strategies as they emerge?
I was going to say, what's Flock and Fledge again? So every vendor that I speak to on a weekly basis is selling me their cookieless solution, right? Everyone's got one. And it's tough because you're spoiled for choice in a way as well, right? As to right, who do I use, what do I test with, etc. But you need to make sure that getting through that marketing messaging of a true approach is key here, right? That said, again, coming to your point, there needs to be a willingness to try, right? The only way you're going to do this is by experimentation, right? No one's got the answer right now. We're all trying to figure it out together. But we need to support one another. That's the thing, is that we're entering a world which is completely different now. We've never been there before, right? So we need to work together on this. And that's where I'm working with other CPG vendors as well, just to try and find out, like, how are they taking it? What are they doing? What approach are they taking? Am I the only one? And I've referred to this earlier, that we're all in the same boat together, but we can move forward together by sharing what we're going through. That's the only way you're going to find out is what's working and what's not working, is by testing, right? But then testing by market as well. So do it live, to within certain markets versus others. It's just dependent on the results of what you're going to get, and you're going to get different results in different markets. So that's why it's key to be testing as well. It's natural to roll out to the largest market, right? Just say, yeah, they've got the most money. Let's just test it there. But it's the main thing here is about adoption and full adoption of this, right, globally. And there's also a key thing, which, like I said, so many vendors coming. So there's no one-stop shop vendor out there that's just going to, sort all your problems out. Unfortunately, you're going to have to test a few, and there's going to be ones which are going to work in one market versus another, right? So you're going to have to look at those different vendors and different approaches, and see, what needs to be leveraged. What are you really looking at? And are you looking at exploring all those options and seeing what's that optimal mix, right? Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 5? Is it 10? Right? That's the only way you're going to be able to do this. And we're currently going through that process right now of testing different vendors out there and saying, okay, this worked. We had X% match rate. Let's try this one. It might be better or something, right? In that cookieless world as well.
Mm-hmm. No, it makes sense. I mean, testing both, as you mentioned, vendors as well as various different strategies, and then focusing on different ways of measuring that effectiveness that aren't reliant on the traditional kind of third-party cookie methods. So testing within a particular market, looking at incrementality for results and revenue, as well as even margins within that particular market, in order to be able to test the effectiveness of potentially a combination of different vendors and different strategies that are being used there. So all very, very illuminating. And I know quite a bit has been covered here. So just to kind of wrap a bow on everything here, we talked first about the different changes that are coming. So the consumer expectations, how those are changing, and how it's so important to put the consumer at the center of your strategy. Doing so via things like A/B testing and optimizing the consent experience of the user can increase those rates of proportions of consenting users to be able to get that fuller view of what's happening on our digital properties. We talked about some of the regulatory changes that are coming down the gradually increasing. Shafi had mentioned how really focusing on understanding the underlying architecture of everything that you're using, understanding what those vendors are, having that solid documentation to be able to inform any changes and new requirements that really come up. We talked about the technical restrictions and focusing on that first-party strategy, testing different approaches, and then also testing things like second-party data. How can we then activate, once we optimize just the volume of first-party data that we have? And then those 3 keys for navigating the new reality. Understanding where you are now, so you can create that roadmap, defining those global standards, doing that across the organization, having representatives from various different stakeholders and teams, and then instilling that culture of testing. So yeah, Shafi, thank you very much for kind of sharing some of these insights and some of these strategies as you're thinking about them. Very valuable, I know, for me, as well as for everyone else. And with that, we can kick it back to Chase.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
Shafi, Lucas, thank you so much. That was an incredibly insightful session, and I think really resonates as well with a summit that we held back in June, a durability summit focused on privacy-centric marketing. The keynote for that event was Sean Downey from Google, and a quote that we actually have printed on T-shirts now is performance is not at odds with privacy. And I think that fits fairly well with what you were talking about.